There's two presentations. So Matt, you'll just continue throughout, and then both of them are on tools for transition. And the first one is regarding the California Pay It Forward project, and the second one is the data analysis to support negotiations for transformative OA agreements.
Thanks very much. I have the unenviable position of being between you and lunch, so I will try to be as engaging as possible. I wanted to start off today with a little bit of a hat tip. First, of course, to Glenn and everybody at Sandlick for inviting me here. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be talking and engaging with all of you. But also to all of the presenters that have gone before me, because I feel like you all have done a lot of my job for me in terms of showing the motivation for a lot of this data analysis work that we've been doing. So we've had several presentations that have really touched on some of the strategy aspects and theoretical aspects, and mentioning things about, we need to crunch the numbers and we need to do our homework. And so that really provides the motivation for what I'm going to show here, which is what does it look like to crunch the numbers and do that homework. So I don't have very many slides that I'll go through. Most of my talk will actually be sort of a live demo on some of the tools that I've built to do this. So I hope you find that interesting, and in general, everything that I'm using I can share with you. And so I hope you'll have those as takeaways. So what's on tap for today? I'm kind of combining my two listed talks into one. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the model calculation tool that we built as a part of the Pay It Forward project, and I'll tell you exactly what that means. That really looks at sort of a general approach to assess the overall feasibility and sustainability of support models for open access. And then I'll also talk more specifically about some of the data analysis that we've done to support our negotiations for transformative OA agreements. That's really targeted towards specific analyses relating to the negotiations that we're embarking upon. So some of the things that Jeff talked about earlier in regards to when we're talking with Elsevier, where we've had struggles coming to conclusion, and talking with Cambridge University Press, where we've had success, and talking with several other publishers, right? And then I'll try to conclude with a few takeaways so that you kind of have an idea of what I'm hoping you'll take from this talk. Which is certainly not intended to be sort of a masterclass in data analysis as much as sort of a demonstration on what we can do and what you might be able to do with these tools as well. But I wanted to put in my own note about why you should care about this. I think that data analysis really represents an important step between theory and practice. And so we've been talking a lot about thinking about structures for open access and support models, but we don't have a lot of experience in practice to this point. And I think that it's important to put data analysis between there so we understand what the theory that we're working on and the support models and the strategies could possibly mean in practice. So we can use these data analyses to make some predictions about what this will look like in the real world before we actually implement anything. That's really important for us to know what we're getting into. And then that leads into my other point here, which is that the analysis that we're doing informs the strategy that we're building, and vice versa. And so it's sort of an iterative process with the strategy development, doing this data analysis to inform what we know about the environment we're operating in, and how we could move forward with changing it. So with that, I'll start with the Pay It Forward model calculation tool. So the Pay It Forward study was a project that I worked on in 2015 and 2016. The goal of this project was to evaluate the viability and sustainability of a large-scale conversion to an APC-funded journal model in North America. So I know that's specifically targeted towards my part of the world, but this is still relevant because the tools that we built to support our analysis in this project can be transferred to data from any part of the world. That's not region specific. And so I would be thrilled if that tool that we put together could be used elsewhere to help others draw similar conclusions or gain a better understanding of the publishing environment. So there are two main components of the Pay It Forward study. One was sort of a qualitative component where we did a lot of author surveys and author focus groups to gain a better understanding of what authors' impressions are of open access, of paying for publication, of how they might respond to different incentives. The other component is the quantitative component, where we gathered a multitude of data from a variety of different sources. So we gathered publication data, we gathered financial and expenditure data, we gathered data about research funding, about APC payments, and put this all together to sort of build this tool that could help us interpret this data in the context of the different structures that we might be building or thinking about, particularly thinking about this potential APC-funded overall model. So I'm not going to go into all of the conclusions because I could probably talk for hours about everything that went into this project. The final report is available here if you're interested in reading more about it. But I will go through a little bit of the models that we built and the assumptions that went into those, just so you have an understanding of what this tool is before I show the tool. So one of the main conclusions from the qualitative portion of the study, from the author focus groups and surveys, is that if authors are asked to pay for publication, they will exhibit price sensitivity when choosing what journal to publish with. This is important, and it maybe sounds a little intuitive, but it was important that we actually gathered the data and the responses from authors to support that. But what this means is that authors will, when they're presented with a choice, they will actually make a rational economic decision. And based on that knowledge, we can build some further assumptions about what this universe would look like where authors are faced with these choices. So in an APC-funded universe, that means that journals would need to compete for authors. And so that informs us about what journal pricing behavior would look like. It tells us that journal prices will likely settle at a level that's really consistent with the value that the author gets by publishing in that journal. And so we can use that knowledge to make some predictions about what APCs might look like in this sort of hypothetical future universe where journals are funded by APCs. What we determined to be the best sort of proxy for quality or for journal value is the SNP value. And Colleen mentioned this earlier. The SNP value is source normalized impact per paper, and it's really a citation-based metric. One of the benefits is that it's normalized by subject, and so a SNP value of 1 represents an average journal in whatever field that journal is in. So based on those assumptions, we were able to build a model to predict the APC of a journal based on the SNP value of that journal. And so that's the equation we have here. This is in US dollars from 2015. We built this through some statistical analysis on data that we gathered about current APC prices and current journal metrics. Right, and so I won't go too in depth into that, other than to mention that we were able to use this APC equation to project the APC for any journal in our data set, as long as that journal had a SNP value within the range of the data that we were looking at. And so the maximum SNP value in that range was 3.2. And so for journals that were sort of higher quality than that, we assumed they had sort of a top level APC, which at the time was $5,000. So that's a little higher now. And then I want to call back to what Jeff was talking about earlier about the multi-payer strategy. This project was really where we started to build this idea of a multi-payer strategy, where for each of those APCs, the library would provide some subsidy or subvention to the authors, and then the authors would be asked to pay the remainder of that APC from grant funds if they have them available, and from other funding sources if they don't have them available. And then we in the library would create structures for these other funding sources so that authors are supported whether they have grant funds or not. And so the model calculation tool that I'll demo in a minute takes this real world data that we've gathered, so all of this publication data and financial data. It takes the multi-payer structure that we want to develop, and we can change the different parameters of that structure. And it applies this APC model to all of that data. So using this tool, we can see how much funding would be required to fund all of the publication for a particular institution, what source that funding would come from, whether it comes from the libraries through those subventions, it comes from grant funders through paying the remainder on those, it comes from other institutional sources. And we can compare those costs to existing knowledge about research funding, about subscription funding, so we can see how the world might change in this environment. So with that, let me go, and I'll try to walk through this tool a little bit. So this first tab is pretty busy. This is really the raw data tab, right? And so I'm not going to force you to read all of this data, but this is where we put all of the publication data. And then the next tab, the model data tab, is where we put any data we have about expenditures under the current model. So this is what we're comparing the new model against. So in this hypothetical institution, UC Hill Valley is not a real institution, and none of this data is real data. This is all sort of made up data. UC Hill Valley is spending about $1.5 million on subscriptions, and is receiving about $180 million in research funding from various funders. In the APC parameters tab, this is where we can put in that equation that we calculated relating SNP to APC. And so we can use this to calculate the APCs, and we can modify that equation if we think there are assumptions that are wrong about that equation. For example, I could update this now because whereas in 2015 when we did this project, the highest APC was 5,000, maybe we want to move this up to 5,200. And you can see that the chart changes there. So that's sort of getting at one of the features of these types of tools that we're building in Excel, is that they're really dynamic and they're responsive to changes that we might make in real time. That allows us to do analysis quicker and be more flexible as we're sort of evaluating the environment that we're in. And then finally, we can set the funding allocation parameters. And so this is where we set up this sort of library subsidy or subvention structure. So what I could set here is that for every paper, for every article, the first thing that's paid is a basic library subsidy of up to $1,000. And then authors are asked to use other discretionary funds for the remainder of the APC. And so once we've set that, then I'll go over and look at the model results. And this is kind of where the answers come out of the black box of this spreadsheet, right? We can see based on the data that we've put in, the publication data and all of the financial data, we can see that we would expect the total cost of publication to be a little over $2 million. That would cover a little over 1,000 papers, of which about 700 papers have grant funding available. So that works out to an average APC under this model of about $2,200. We can see based on the structure that we've put in, the library would pay about $1 million in those subventions, and then grant funds would be used to pay about $900,000. And for those authors that don't have grant funds available, other discretionary funds that are set up by the library could be used to pay about $300,000. And so scrolling down, we can kind of compare this to our existing data. So we can compare what the library is paying under this model to the funds that we've determined the library has in subscriptions for these particular journals. And we can see how the world might change, or how the expenditures or funding flows might change from the existing subscription model to this sort of hypothetical APC model in the future. And then, like I said, this is all sort of dynamic. And so what we can do is if we decide to pay maybe a different subsidy, like let's say we want to pay a slightly higher subsidy, we can just change it there and go back to the model results tab. And we can see that these total numbers change, right? So now that we've increased the library subsidy, the library is paying more, of course. The granting agencies are paying a little bit less. And so that makes the total institutional cost about $1.5 million, which is exactly what we're paying now. So we can use this to sort of stress test our models, stress test our numbers, and figure out what this future universe might look like, and whether it's something that we think is feasible for our institution to move towards.